The conference room was stuffy. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us like 1,000 angry bees, and the heavy, polished table between us felt like a fortress. Around it sat the usual cast: upper management, the marketing director, and a handful of account execs. Everyone was already muttering, trying to get in their 2 cents before Chris Anderson entered. Chris, the sales executive everyone seemed to think had great potential. The kind of potential that looks impressive in quarterly reports but crumbles when faced with actual substance. I sat quietly at the edge of the table, watching him. He walked in wearing that forced charisma of someone who knew he didn't belong, but convinced himself and everyone around him that he did. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up just enough to expose a wrist full of silver bracelets that looked like they belonged in a boutique, not a boardroom. "Morning, team," he said, flashing a grin that could be described as too eager to be genuine. His eyes darted around the room, landing on me briefly. A calculated glance just long enough to show he was sizing me up, but I wasn't there to play games. I didn't need his approval. I had made my mark long before he strolled into this company with his slick promises and half-baked strategies. "Let's get to it," Chris said, cutting through the low hum of idle chatter. "We're here to discuss the new branding proposal. Marketing's been pushing this for weeks, but I think we can take it to the next level. Streamline things. Make it more marketable." He gave a quick nod, as if trying to will the room into believing his every word. I didn't like where this was going. Chris had always been the type to talk the talk, but when it came to walking the walk well, he tripped over his own feet. He was a sales executive, not a designer. His knowledge of aesthetics stretched as far as looking good on a billboard. I held my breath as I carefully scanned the slides of my latest design concept. The rebranding was supposed to be bold, modern, something that would resonate with our audience and speak to the heart of our brand's identity. Every line, every curve, every color choice was deliberate. It wasn't just graphic design, it was a statement. Chris wasn't interested in statements, though. He was interested in getting his name on the final contract, getting his sales commission, and moving on to his next conquest. He cleared his throat. "So Jessica, love the design, but we need to talk about some revisions. These colors? They're not doing it for me. I mean, I don't know, do they really pop enough for a new wave of customers?" His tone was condescending, like he had the authority to question my work, even though he had never once spent a day in a design studio. "And this logo? Too soft. We need something stronger, more aggressive. You know, something that screams success, power, money." I felt my pulse quicken, but I stayed calm. My eyes narrowed just a fraction, watching him as he continued. He was digging himself into a hole, and he didn't even realize it. He turned to the team with a smile that looked more like a grin of someone who had just discovered they could dunk a basketball for the first time. "I think we can all agree that Jessica's work is a good start, but it's not finished. Not the way it needs to be for a company like ours." The room fell silent. I could hear the hum of the lights again. I could feel the heat of everyone's eyes flicking between Chris and me, waiting for a reaction. But I had learned long ago not to show my cards too early. "Chris," I said, my voice calm, controlled, nearly clinical. "The design is finished. It's tailored to our target audience, and it aligns perfectly with the market research we gathered." Chris waved a dismissive hand. "Yeah, but what about, actual market visibility? How is this supposed to connect with people who buy fast cars, expensive watches, and yachts?" He leaned forward, trying to sell his narrative with the same fake enthusiasm he used to sell software licenses. "It's a branding overhaul. It's about more than just making it look nice. It's about making people feel like they need to buy." And there it was. He was using my work as the vehicle for his own ambition. He was trying to manipulate my design into a commodity, a product to be sold, an image to be packaged. It was a power play, disguised as concern for the company. It didn't help that the marketing director, Paul, was too busy nodding along with Chris like a half-committed puppet to see the flaw in his logic. "You're right," Chris continued, turning to Paul for validation. "We need to rethink the whole thing. Jessica's a talented designer, but maybe we need someone who understands the bigger picture of this project." His words hung in the air like a challenge. The room was quiet again. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to position himself as the savior of this project, as the visionary behind the brand's future, and in the process, he was trying to strip me of the one thing that had always been my strength: my control over my work. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was already calculating. I had seen his arrogance before, brief, self-destructive, and ultimately, predictable. The more he pushed, the deeper he dug. "I'll take that under advisement," I said, just loud enough to let the team hear. "But before we make any changes, let's take a look at the consumer feedback and the target demographic analysis. Maybe that'll help us shape the discussion." Chris looked at me like I had just suggested we throw out the entire project. "Feedback? What feedback? This is the final design. We're not going to waste time on analysis." His voice rose, irritation seeping through his carefully curated mask. I could almost feel the satisfaction of knowing where this was headed. Chris had just made his first critical mistake. He was too eager, too dismissive, too sure of himself in ways that made him dangerously blind to the consequences. He had no idea what I had set in motion, what leverage I had. I could destroy him with a single phone call. I didn't act just yet, though. The game had only just begun. He would burn himself out with no help from me. I smiled faintly, watching him squirm. "Of course, Chris. You're the expert." The email had come through like a whisper in the dark. A single line of text that changed everything. "Audit on Chris Anderson's sales project scheduled for review. Someone's pulling the strings." Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. The timing was impeccable. The kind of power play only a seasoned corporate strategist would recognize. This was the beginning of Chris's unraveling, and I was going to help it along. But for now, I had to play the long game. Patience, after all, is the true weapon of the quietly competent. The next day, I arrived early to the office just as the morning sunlight was creeping through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the polished floor. My fingers drummed on the edge of my desk as I opened up the email again, rereading it. The audit was on its way, but I knew Chris didn't realize how badly he was exposed. He was like a moth darting toward a flame, oblivious to the fact that the fire would burn him alive before he ever reached it. At the same time, I couldn't risk acting too quickly. If I made my move now, he could still spin the story. He had a way of charming people into thinking he was just one unlucky step away from victory. I had to ensure there was no escape, no way for him to climb out of the hole he was digging. So, I went to work. The first step was simple: gather information. I didn't need to dig through mountains of corporate records. I needed something more subtle, something that would hit Chris where it hurt the most. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up financials, old memos, and sales reports. He had been pushing this rebranding deal for months, and I needed to understand exactly where he was misstepping. One email stood out in the sales report, buried in the timeline like a crack in a foundation, a string of messages that revealed Chris had bypassed the usual legal review for his new partnership, pushing the deal through faster than the company's own procedures allowed. Perfect. That was a red flag. A legal violation. And a big one at that. The company's legal department was notoriously strict, and if this ever got out, well, it would destroy not just Chris's career, but the credibility of the entire sales division. I forwarded the email to myself, attaching a short note to my personal folder for later use. Unapproved contract keep for audit. Next, I made the rounds. Casual conversations with a few key people in marketing and legal, just enough to let them know the project was under scrutiny. I didn't need to say anything overtly suspicious. I just needed to plant the seed, and I knew exactly who to target. Paul in marketing, weak, indecisive, and too easily swayed by authority, was an easy mark. A quiet word here, a passing comment there, and before long, he was panicking about the audit, muttering about how things were going too fast with Chris's project. He would be the first to leak it when things fell apart. I'd make sure of that. It wasn't long before I caught wind of Chris's latest bold move to accelerate the deal even further. He had scheduled a meeting with a high-profile client, bypassing all the usual vetting procedures, determined to finalize everything before the audit could get its teeth into the deal. But there was a problem. The client had a history of being notoriously meticulous about legal terms, and had once backed out of a deal because of a minor oversight in paperwork. This wasn't the kind of deal you rushed through. I picked up the phone and made a few quiet calls, one to a lawyer I knew, another to a trusted contact in corporate risk management. Within an hour, I had a small but significant piece of intelligence. Chris was about to make a fatal mistake. He was pushing the client too hard, demanding they sign on the spot without proper review. If the deal went through, he'd secure his position. If it didn't, he'd be exposed as an arrogant fool. I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. I had set the pieces in motion. Chris was playing his hand too quickly, like someone desperate to make a splash. His arrogance was his biggest weakness, and I was counting on him to push just a little too far. But then something unexpected happened. The phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered, barely masking my surprise. "Jessica Taylor?" The voice on the other end was calm, collected. The kind of voice that made you sit up straight. "Yes," I replied, cautious. "I'm with the internal audit department. We're looking into a few discrepancies with the branding project. It seems there's been an oversight." I didn't flinch. I knew exactly what this was. The audit had already started and Chris hadn't even seen it coming. "Of course. What do you need from me?" I kept my tone neutral. "All business. We'll be conducting interviews with the key stakeholders. We just wanted to confirm that you're available tomorrow morning. This is a priority." I hung up and exhaled slowly, my fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. The audit was in motion now, and Chris was walking right into it, unaware. But this was only the beginning. The real play was just starting. The pressure was mounting, and Chris wasn't handling it well. His emails were getting more frantic, his tone increasingly defensive. He kept pushing the client, trying to force them into signing the deal without the proper legal review. I could already hear the soft whispers spreading through the office, rumors of mistakes, of things slipping through the cracks. The countdown had begun. The walls were closing in on Chris, and the final trap was about to spring. There's a certain beauty in watching a plan unfold. The trick is not to rush it. Every moment of tension, every hint of panic that shows in your target's eyes, is a step toward victory. It's like watching a building collapse, brick by brick, slow enough to savor every moment of the downfall. Chris didn't realize it yet, but the walls were closing in on him. Every little move he made, every corner he tried to cut, was adding another layer of weight to his already fragile position. The audit was scheduled for the following morning. The email had been brief, but the tone was clear. It was going to be thorough. Chris wasn't even on the radar yet. He was still too busy scrambling to close the deal with that client, thinking he could rush it through before the hammer dropped. He was wrong. I'd taken every necessary step to ensure that the pieces were perfectly in place. The legal violations were documented. The unchecked contract had been forwarded to the board. I had made sure to leak just enough to the marketing department to get the whispers started. And I had lined up my own meeting with the audit team, offering just enough of my insights to guide them without appearing too eager. But what I didn't anticipate was how fast things would spiral out of control for him. The morning of the audit, Chris was already on edge. I could see it in his face during the all-staff meeting. Nervous energy, too many glances at his phone, too many forced laughs in response to comments that weren't even funny. He was on the verge of a breakdown, though he hadn't yet realized just how much he was exposed. It was almost too easy to push him into full panic mode. It started with an email, one that I knew would get under his skin. I'd sent a message to the CEO, attaching a summary of the discrepancies in Chris's project, making sure to highlight the unapproved contract and the urgent need for review. I'd also included a note from a senior lawyer confirming that, in their opinion, the deal Chris was pushing could result in significant legal consequences for the company. The CEO's response was swift. "Let's discuss in the meeting this afternoon." Chris didn't stand a chance. The thing about corporate culture is that it runs on paper trails, emails, memos, reports. Once something is in writing, it's not easy to bury it, no matter how charming or arrogant you might be. By the time Chris realized the CEO had been copied, it was too late. The audit was on his tail, the board was being alerted, and there was nothing he could do but keep pretending that everything was fine. And then came the cracks. The client who had been wavering on the deal, a high-profile, notoriously meticulous brand, had finally caught on. They began asking pointed questions, digging into the contract with a kind of precision that Chris wasn't prepared for. He had pushed them too hard, too fast, and now they were circling like sharks. Word spread through the office about the increasingly hostile calls Chris was getting from the client's legal team. He started ignoring emails, making excuses for missed meetings, hoping that somehow, if he just kept talking fast enough, it would all blow over. It wouldn't. The next day, just as the audit team arrived for their preliminary meetings, Chris's worst nightmare arrived in the form of a phone call. The client had pulled out, and this time, they weren't just backing away from the deal, they were publicly denouncing the company for rushing them into an agreement, citing numerous unapproved clauses in the contract that hadn't been properly reviewed. Chris's face went ashen when he heard the news. I was there, of course, just across the room, casually sipping my coffee, watching the storm build in his eyes. He tried to regain control, tried to spin the narrative, but it was obvious that everything was slipping away. As the word spread through the office, So did the rumors. No one could ignore the implications of what was happening. There were talks of a press release, talks of a scandal. People were starting to talk whispers of Chris's incompetence, his arrogance, the deal that never was. Then the meeting started. I sat in the boardroom, watching Chris fidget with his tie. His usual bravado was gone, replaced with a desperation that I hadn't seen before. He knew this was it. This was where the walls were closing in. His project was under the microscope, and he could already feel the eyes of the board on him, waiting for him to either sink or swim. The CEO began by introducing the audit team, and Chris managed a stiff smile. "We've gathered some preliminary findings regarding your sales project, Chris," the lead auditor said. Her tone, businesslike, but laced with an undertone of judgment. "And there are several areas that need to be addressed." Chris stiffened. "What kind of areas are we talking about?" "Unapproved contracts, violations of company protocol, and significant delays due to mismanagement." She glanced down at her tablet, but not before I saw the brief flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Chris's hand clenched into a fist under the table. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. But the words were hollow. His mouth was dry. The room was suffocatingly quiet. But then, just as I'd predicted, the first domino fell. Chris's defense was flimsy at best. His excuses didn't hold up when the audit team began rattling off the facts. Emails he hadn't seen, contracts he hadn't reviewed, calls he had missed, each one a crack in his carefully constructed facade. It was clear to everyone in the room that he was out of his depth. Chris wasn't a visionary leader. He was a fraud, and his hubris had led him to this moment of reckoning. Just as the meeting reached its peak, the CEO's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he said, standing up abruptly. "I need to take this." A few seconds passed. The room grew thick with tension. When he returned, his face was pale. "We have a problem," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The client has gone public. They've released a statement, and it's not good." Chris's fate had just taken a darker turn. And now the world was going to see exactly what he was made of. The air in the boardroom was so thick with tension it felt like it could suffocate you. The CEO stood there, still clutching his phone, a barely concealed sense of dread washing over him. The rest of the board stared at him, silent, waiting for some kind of answer. Chris, on the other hand, looked like he had just been struck by lightning. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously from one person to another, like a rat cornered in a cage. He had been so sure of himself, so damn confident. And now, all of a sudden, he was nothing but a bundle of nerves, flailing against a force much bigger than his bloated ego could ever imagine. The CEO finally spoke. "Chris," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Do you know what you've done?" Chris didn't respond immediately. I could see his mind racing, trying to piece together a defense, trying to come up with some plausible excuse. But the words wouldn't come. His arrogance had led him to believe he could bully his way through any obstacle. Now that very arrogance had become his prison. "The client has gone public," the CEO continued, this time with more authority. "They've released a full statement detailing everything. The unapproved clauses, the rushed contract, and worst of all, your utter disregard for the company's procedures. They've already pulled their funding, and they're speaking to the press." At this point, Chris was visibly sweating. His eyes flicked to the door, like he might try to make a break for it, but there was no escape, not anymore. "I didn't," Chris began, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't even lie his way out of this one. "Don't bother," the CEO cut him off, his patience completely gone. "The board's already aware of the situation, and we've been getting calls all morning. The press is going to eat this up." That was when it hit me. This wasn't just a corporate crisis, it was a scandal in the making. And the worst part? Chris had no idea how deep the hole went. He had been so focused on getting the deal done, so eager to secure his position, that he hadn't even considered the legal ramifications of rushing through a contract without proper approval. Now it was too late. The damage was irreversible. I could see the board members exchanging glances, some of them already making mental notes for their own agendas. This was their chance to act, to distance themselves from Chris and secure their own futures. But none of them had the stomach to deliver the blow themselves, not just yet. So, it was up to me. "I think it's time for you to step down, Chris," I said, my voice calm, but carrying an edge of finality. Chris turned to me, eyes wide with disbelief. What? This is. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to piece together what had just happened. This is a mistake, Jessica. You have to understand. I was just trying to help the company move forward. You can't. No, Chris. I interrupted, my voice still even, controlled. You've made a series of catastrophic mistakes. And now it's time to face the consequences. The rebranding you've been pushing is a failure, the client has turned on us, and the legal issues are mounting by the hour. If you think for 1 second you're walking away from this unscathed, you're gravely mistaken. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, waiting for the moment of reckoning. The CEO wasn't even looking at Chris anymore. He was flipping through some papers, as if this was all part of his plan. The chairman of the board, an older man with a permanent frown and a reputation for ruthlessness, finally spoke up. We'll be discussing the matter further, but for now, Chris, I think it's best if you leave the room. The audit is still ongoing, and we'll need to review the full scope of your actions. For the company's sake. Chris's face twisted with anger and panic. You can't do this, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I've worked here longer than half of you. I'm the one who brought in those clients. I'm the one who. The CEO stood up sharply, cutting him off. No, Chris. You were the one who nearly destroyed everything. Now, I suggest you leave before this gets worse for you. It was over. The room had already decided his fate. And Chris knew it. His arrogance was no match for the power dynamics of the boardroom. For a brief moment, he stood there, frozen like a child who had just been told there were no more excuses, no more second chances. He slowly gathered his things, his movements stiff and robotic. He made one last attempt to salvage some pride, but the words failed him. His exit was less an act of defiance and more a humiliating surrender. As Chris left the room, the silence lingered for a moment before the board erupted in whispers. The tension was palpable, but it was the kind of tension that only comes after a power shift. Chris was gone, and there was no coming back from this. I couldn't help but feel a small thrill. I had orchestrated this downfall with precision, no violence, no overt confrontation, just the cold, calculated execution of a plan that had been months in the making. Chris had never seen it coming. A few hours later, the email came in. The official statement from the company. It is with regret that we announce the departure of Chris Anderson from the company, effective immediately. A full internal audit is underway to ensure that all procedures and contracts are in compliance with industry standards. It was a clean break, neatly tied up, but I knew better. Chris's departure wasn't just a corporate decision, it was a public humiliation, a career-ending blow. He would be remembered for his hubris, his incompetence, and the fact that he thought he could outsmart the system. He had been the loudest person in the room, but in the end, it was the quiet, strategic power players who had destroyed him. As the day went on, the fallout continued to spread. The press picked up the story within hours, spinning it into a full-blown scandal. There were whispers of an SEC investigation, leaks to the media, and rumors that Chris's recklessness had cost the company millions. The walls were closing in on Chris, and now the company's reputation was on the line. The final blow was about to fall, and I had a front-row seat. The CEO's office was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that you only get when everything is about to change, when the final, irreversible decisions are made. I walked in, my shoes clicking on the polished floor, as I took my seat across from him. He was already there, seated behind his large mahogany desk, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the papers in front of him. I had no idea what was coming, but I knew one thing for certain. This was the end of Chris Anderson. Jessica, the CEO began, his voice calm but with a hint of something colder underneath. I wanted to meet with you before the final decision was made. I raised an eyebrow, already aware of what was coming. Final decision? I asked, playing the game. But I knew what he meant. Chris was done. They just needed to finalize the paperwork. The CEO nodded. Yes, the board's been in discussions all afternoon. The fallout from his actions, legal, financial, reputational, is too much. It's clear we need to act swiftly. I kept my expression neutral. But inside, I was already savoring the moment. He continued. We've decided to part ways with Chris, officially. But we need your input on one last thing. I leaned forward slightly, curious. What's that? He placed a thick folder on the table in front of me. His exit package. We need to finalize it. The decision is unanimous, but the optics need to be right. It's going to be a public exit, and we need the press to spin it as a mutual departure. Clean. Professional. I could hear the words, but they were almost irrelevant now. It didn't matter what package they offered Chris. What mattered was that the consequences of his arrogance, his disregard for process, and his desperate attempts to manipulate the system were about to come to light. The final blow came just hours later, at exactly 5:30 p.m. When the world was winding down for the evening, the company released the official statement. After a thorough review, Chris Anderson is no longer with the company, effective immediately. An internal audit revealed serious breaches in protocol regarding a recent sales contract. The company has taken all necessary steps to address the situation and is working to ensure that such oversights do not happen again. We wish Mr. Anderson the best in his future endeavors. The message was crisp, professional, but the underlying truth was there for anyone who was paying attention. The breaches were a direct result of his reckless behavior. He had violated company policy. He had risked millions for the sake of his own ambition, and now he was paying the price. But the real humiliation came when the media picked it up. The story exploded across news outlets, blogs, and social media. Headlines like, "Sales Executive Fired After Breaching Corporate Protocol," and "Company Audits Sales Exec for Legal Violations and Risky Deals," spread like wildfire. The press didn't stop there. They began digging into Chris's past, uncovering previous reports of mishandled deals, client complaints, and even a few mentions of questionable practices that had never seen the light of day. The scandal didn't just ruin Chris's career at our company, it ruined his reputation entirely. The phone calls from other companies stopped. The offers dried up. It didn't matter how many connections he had, his name was now synonymous with failure and incompetence. Meanwhile, the CEO had his own set of problems. Despite their attempts to spin the story, the board was nervous. An internal audit was one thing. But now, with Chris's name tarnished and the press digging deeper, questions about the company's internal controls started to surface. Were they really doing enough to ensure that high-level executives weren't making such reckless decisions? But none of that mattered to me. I had my own victory to savor. I didn't gloat, not outwardly. Anyway. But I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction as I watched the chaos unfold. Chris's downfall wasn't just about his failure, it was about the culmination of all the years I had spent quietly working behind the scenes, building my influence, and observing the weaknesses around me. He had underestimated me from the start. And now, that same arrogance had been his undoing. He thought he could outsmart the system, bypass protocol, and push his way through. But I knew better. I had watched and waited for the perfect moment, and I had struck with precision. The power wasn't in loud confrontations or explosive outbursts. It was in knowing when to move, how to maneuver the system to your advantage, and how to let your target dig their own grave. A week later, I received a text from one of my contacts at the law firm handling the aftermath. Chris Anderson's company filings are being flagged. His previous sales deals are under investigation. Looks like the SEC is getting involved. They're making a federal case of it. I almost smiled at that. It wasn't just the company that would suffer. Chris was going down hard. The legal consequences were going to be brutal, and there would be no way for him to escape. He had tried to play the system, but the system had played him. And now, in the end, it was my quiet intelligence, my strategic patience, that had won out. As for me, I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had done what I set out to do. The company had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the quiet one. I stood at my desk, looking out the window at the city skyline. The storm had passed, and everything was settling into place. There would always be another Chris Anderson, another arrogant, reckless fool who thought they could bulldoze their way to the top. But I was always watching, always waiting. And when the time came, I would strike again. The thing about power, I said quietly to myself, staring at the skyline, is that it doesn't come from loud gestures or big displays. It comes from knowing how to maneuver in silence. From understanding the rules so thoroughly that you don't need to break them. And when the time is right, you can let the world crash down around you with nothing more than a quiet, well-placed move. I turned off my computer, gathered my things, and headed out the door. The game was over. But in this world, there's always another game to play. And I'd be ready.